What if I told you that the reason your client plateaus in therapy quite possibly began before they could even walk? As clinicians, we often treat cognitive, behavioral, emotional, and physical or motor issues, motor challenges, in isolation. But science shows us that movement is actually the foundation of cognition. So in this video, I'm going to show you why and how motor development actually builds the neural scaffolding for higher brain functions. And we're going to go into how the NIT, the Neuro Integrative Theory, gives us a way, a roadmap to restart that neural development when things get off track. You can also download my free clinical guide, 5 Brain Body Breakthroughs, in the link below. It's packed with insights from my 20 plus years as an occupational therapist and has the latest in brain body integration science. Hi, I'm Kim Prince, functional neurology specialist and occupational therapist of nearly 25 years. Today, let's dive into how cognitive and motor development are intertwined, how they work together, not in silos. So any of you who are in the 40 plus crowd probably had a teacher who used a projector and had the different clear slides they could write on with dry erase markers and layer information. If we did that with a motor development timeline and a cognitive development timeline and we laid them right over the top of each other, what we would see is that there are motor and cognitive milestones that all line up. When we're learning to roll over from back to stomach, stomach to back, we're having a cognitive milestone at the same time of facial recognition or object permanence. And they're all along the way. And it doesn't just stop in those first couple years of development. I'm talking about nuanced cognitive skills, executive functioning skills that line up with fine motor development and some of the motor milestones that come later on into even pushing into the teenage years. So this idea of cognitive and motor development being intertwined is from before we're born in utero all the way through often into our teenage years. And that is what sets the ground for how organized our neural firing becomes. When movement is restricted or reflexes don't integrate through those movement milestones, the entire sequence of development gets interrupted because it is kind of in stages, right? Neurodevelopment is stage related and it's on this evolutionary timeline, if you will, where the integration of reflexes and the maturation at one stage almost opens the door for the next stage of development. And now, because we are miraculously designed creation, we will continue through and we'll get to 2 feet even when we miss these things, but it makes the next layer of neural development more difficult. It makes us have to work harder to get to the same outcomes. So we often see that when our expectations or when the demands that are put on us, i.e. when a child gets to school age, we start to see these problems pop up because now the workload is heavier and any of the inefficiencies, anything that isn't really working well, starts to show up as problems when we get to those ages. So even though something may have started when we were really little, we don't necessarily see the effects of it until we're older. And that's often what sends us looking at these things as separate entities because we haven't looked at the full developmental timeline of how this is a stage-related and evolutionary sequence of development. And what we see also is that these aren't just physical delays, or it's not just a cognitive delay, it's actually neurological disorganization. It impacts learning, behavior, emotional regulation, and even social engagement. So for example, you may see that a child skipped crawling, right? Maybe they were one of those up on 2 feet and I'm off to the races. And everybody's like, yay, you were such an early walker. Way to go. Your kid is just ahead of the curve. Must be awesome. But later they start to show poor cross-body coordination, right? That midline, imaginary middle line, we have trouble crossing over. We have trouble using our hand on the opposite side of our body. And that is going to bleed into posture. It's going to bleed into reading, the use of eye tracking and teaming, and you're going to start to see issues with focus and attention and all of those things that are higher up on the developmental timeline because of some motor bits that were askew or not experienced or didn't mature and integrate in some of the younger years. And I think one of the biggest things to point out, because that's not necessarily a foreign conversation if you're treating in the pediatric realm of things, when there's talk of sensory integration and motor development, there's a little bit more of a familiar conversation around this. But I think when we look especially at clinicians treating adults, a lot of times this connection is missed, right? We may be treating someone diagnosed later in life with ADHD because of the executive function disorders, because of the attention, focus, motivation kind of pieces that are missing. Or maybe we're in addiction, compulsive behaviors, and we're dealing more in those challenges that are commonplace there. Or maybe we're in the mood and emotion disorders. We're dealing with anxieties, depressions, things of that nature. But what I really hope that we're able to see and build an understanding for in this video is that connection between even those challenges that are experienced as a 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old may have a root in neural organization because of this connected nature, the stages of development, and that foundational stage with some of those big motor milestones being missed can set the stage for an emotional imbalance that makes it really hard to access cognitive function. So, and the other thing I think to point out here before we dive in any further is that this doesn't just apply to missed milestones or inefficiently experienced milestones as a child, that when we are older and we have big acute traumatic events, the disorganization, the changes in brain structure and function to the amygdala, to the hippocampus, those kind of areas actually creates the same changes to those areas as it does when the motor development isn't experienced fully as a kiddo. So even though we're an adult and we went through development perfectly fine, those big traumatic acute incidents can be enough to kind of switch the wiring, the neural scaffolding, back to as if we didn't. But that also opens the door for a recalibration by the same tools, by the same methods. So let's look at an example of that stage-related evolutionary development that we talked about. So there's some research from McLean, who talks about the idea of a triune brain, right? That we have brainstem mediated reflexes, and then we have midbrain bits, and then we have cortical bits. And each motor milestone, like let's say that A pedal, right? We're learning to roll back to stomach, stomach to back, we're kind of army crawling on our bellies, that those milestones line up with the maturation or integration of A pedal primitive reflexes. So we have this A pedal bit that lines up with this primitive bit. And those are really brainstem mediated bits, survival mechanisms. And when we don't fully experience that input, right, the importance of tummy time, this is where that comes from. That input on chest and stomach that integrates those reflexes is really important in helping to mature the reflexes mediated by that brainstem. It helps to calm them so that we open access to the next stage of development. And that's when we start, right, getting on all fours. So now we're crawling around, and that's that midbrain development, right? And there's different sets of reflexes that help to navigate momentum and gravity and equilibrium and posture and all of those bits on all fours, where we start to figure out which muscles we need to contract and relax to begin to actually navigate gravity. But those physical motor milestones line up with the different emotional regulation bits, the chemistry part of our brain, what's creating what kind of chemistry that allows us to then have access to that cortical functioning, right? Everything that we think of as executive functioning when we come upright to 2 feet. Now we're judging momentum and really talking vestibular function and proprioceptive awareness. Where am I? Body awareness. Where am I in space and time? And those bits line up with that left-right hemisphere communication. How quickly is information processed? How appropriate are our responses? Storing skills and information in that cortex only happens if we have access to that cortex. So we're beginning to develop this need for integration and maturation through all of the stages to have really solid access to executive function. Now, if any of those milestones are skipped or delayed, it's not just a missed movement, it's missed integration. It's changes to brain chemistry. It's setting up what I think of as the filters for how we perceive information. So our brain is a reactive organ, right? Information, sensory stimuli comes in, it responds and sends an output. But it is also a predictive organ. And those predictions, the way your brain anticipates and responds to, or sends a response out, an output, before a stimuli even happens, that predictive ability is created, it's set up by past experiences. And this developmental season of our life is really, really important for setting up the way that our brain is going to predict and respond in adulthood. So that's why this time as a child is such a powerful time when it comes to neurologic organization and function. So often as therapists, we see clients with executive dysfunction, anxiety, or attention issues, and we can miss the root cause. We miss that it could be this unintegrated reflex bit, the sensory processing bit, or really even an underdeveloped or inefficient vestibular system. Because sensory integration, visual function, even our autonomic nervous system regulation doesn't happen without vestibular function. That vestibular system, which we'll get into in future videos, is really, really foundationally key to the way all these other systems work together and how your brain is able to make sense and create appropriate responses to the stimuli that are coming in. So we have to, I think, in this day and age, to really stand out and be that go-to clinician, we have to have an understanding of how these systems interplay. We have to understand that the cerebellum isn't just for balance. It predicts, it refines, it supports cognition. It is absolutely key in task acquisition and learning new things, working memory, all of these bits. So things that we've seen as having primarily motor functions, when we dig and we become educated at a systems model of understanding, not a symptom model of management, that systems understanding begins to really show us like, oh, as clinicians, there is continuing education that we need to dive into to be able to A, stand out in the sea of potential therapists, but B, really to provide our clients with the top level care that's going to get them the most results and get them back into thriving in life as quick as possible. So just want to share a quick story, case study, if you will, of a client I had in her 20s, diagnosed with ADHD, diagnosed with some bipolar, mental health kind of mood and emotional stuff going on, who had been in therapy for years, right? Done all the CBT, all the dialectical behavioral therapy, was actually on lithium, had been on lithium for 14 years. But what had never been addressed for her was that brain-body loop, right? So when she was able to dive in and recalibrate using the NeuroFlow protocol, that reintegration and connection between brain and body reorganized neural pathways, re-scaffolded the way that she could process sensory information, the body awareness that she had. And through addressing that brain-body loop, the systems became more efficient. She was able to get off of the lithium. She was able to, side note, she was also having like splitting migraines and all of these visual issues because there was so much dysfunction in the sensory processing component. Her eyeballs were overloaded so easily. So looking at a screen was like an impossibility. 10 minutes on the screen and it was splitting headache and migraine. And the level of agitation, if there was much sensory input, like going to the movie theater, would send her over the edge, right? Like just irritated, agitated, and she thought that she had there is a character flaw in me, that I have this level of agitation and anger. But turns out it's really a deep rooted sensory disintegration, sensory regulation challenge, because for so long, the loop that had been being reinforced was this overreactive, hyperprotective response to sensory stimuli, right? Danger, we need to block it all out. Fight, flight, freeze, everything's out of here. My own safety internally is the conversation that her brain and body were having. And until she went and hit the ground and reintegrated that brain-body loop, they couldn't snap the cycle on what appeared to be the mental, emotional side of things. So just to illuminate how important this brain-body connection is, even well into adulthood. This isn't a childhood issue. I think that's the thing that I really want to drive home. This is not a childhood issue. This is a human issue. If you have a nervous system, you have the potential for disorganization in how all the systems are communicating. So we always need to be looking foundationally. If we have a block, if we have a plateau, if something that should be working isn't, we seem to keep hitting this wall, look a layer deeper. Look at the electrical system, the literal way that our brain and body communicate, and let's kind of fortify there and see what happens for all those higher level functions. We kind of have two schools of thought, right? We have this bottom-up approach, or we have this top-down approach to managing challenges, treating dysfunction. The traditional model is we change the thought to change the behavior. But with the Neuro Integrative Theory model, the idea is to reset the body loop to reduce the stress signal in the first place. Like if that movement, the development that we talked about, if that movement is responsible for setting the filters and the predicting that your brain does, the anticipation and the responses that your brain creates, then we need to go and make sure that that filter and those perceptions are set at an appropriate level to the stimuli that are happening in your life, right? Because when that gets too anticipatory, when it's hyper responsive, then we're reacting in ways that are not in proportion to the actual stimuli that are coming in. But if we're going top down and we're trying to think our way into changing behaviors, we're trying to think our way into changing processes that aren't controlled by conscious thought, we're setting ourselves up to work really, really, really hard for very little growth and change. Because the moment a stimuli triggers that stress response, we are designed in a protective fashion to change the chemistry, the chemicals that dump in our blood, to cut out cognitive access. All of our attention drops down to protection and survival. You don't get access to rational thought when you're in survival mode. So the paradigm shift in how we approach things as a clinician, I think really starts there, of a bottom-up approach to treatment as opposed to a top-down approach to managing symptoms or creating behavior change. So I think the bottom line to all of it is that you really just can't outthink a reflex arc. You can't outthink the HTPA and its response to stress. Those protective pieces, because our brain is ultimately a protective organ, it is designed to keep us alive, those are the lowest common denominator bits that are going to win every time. So as long as we continue to address the higher levels of cognition and thinking to create change in behavior, in emotion, we're going to be working really hard and not get very far. And that's precisely why I developed the NeuroFlow protocol, because most clients that I've seen over the last 25 years don't need more tools. They've done all the therapies, they've built all the skills, they have all the know-how, but they don't have access to it in the times that they need it. So what they need is a full recalibration of the brain-body communication loop. They need to restore the neuroscaffolding so that the brain and the body are talking to each other efficiently, quickly, and can predict and respond in appropriate ways that gives them constant access to that cognition. So I think really the key points to take away from this is that movement quite literally builds cognition. So when you have a skipped or disorganized motor milestone, you're going to have some layer of cognitive dysfunction. And it may not show up right away. You may not see it until the demands of life get a little bit higher. And then you're like, why all of a sudden can I not function? Or why is there suddenly this lack of focus or these attention issues or this emotional reactivity? Probably because there's some layer of disorganization in the nervous system that's creating those protective responses when the workload gets too high. And I think also in that, one of the other big key takeaways is that big acute stress later in life creates the same protective brain changes as a missed milestone during development does. So whether you missed a milestone or whether you have this chronic long-term stress or big acute stressful incident, you end up with the same neural organization issues, the dysregulation in your nervous system that are going to create a lot of the same issues of emotional volatility, reactivity, and struggles with executive function, with working memory, with problem solving, with motivation, with all of those things that we see people back in treatment for. A lot of times the root below the root below the root is going to live in that nervous system function. So the Neuro Integrative Theory gives us that roadmap with how to fix the root cause issue. And I think overall the best clinicians that I've had the pleasure of working with are always the ones who are seeking to find the root cause, who are looking at systems integration and not just symptom management. And I think that is the key this day and age of where we are in the therapeutic world, of not just interdisciplinary teams and working with other therapists, but individual therapists also having a systems mindset where they understand the pieces of how these different things connect together, so that we stop this continued cycle of plateaus or people having to be in therapy for year after year after year, and actually begin to produce the help and the results and the change that we all got into this profession to be able to provide for people. If this resonated with you, go grab the free download, 5 Brain Body Breakthroughs, that's below, and know that it outlines for you how to spot and resolve the hidden neural misfires that are blocking your client's progress. And plus, it goes into how the NRT protocol does it in just 5 stages and really sets the ground for a systems-based approach for you to implement in your clinic and get the best results out of all the things that you're already doing with your clients. And if you want to go deeper, stay tuned for next week's video. We're going to go into the 3 hidden stages that shape brain function. So I'll see y'all there.